We're joined now from Kent by the former Conservative leader, Micheal Howard. Micheal Howard, the EU says it won't talk about any future relationship with the UK until there's been what it calls sufficient progress on agreeing the divorce bill. Should the UK agree to this phased approach?
Well, I think you can make too much about the sequence and the timing of the negotiations. I assume that it will be a case of nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And so any agreements that might be reached on things that are talked about early on will be very provisional. And so I think you can make a big deal about the timing and the sequence when I don't think it really matters as much as all that.
Don't people have a right in this country to be surprised by all this talk of a massive multi-billion-pound divorce settlement? I mean, I don't remember either side making much of this in the referendum, do you?
No, and indeed a select committee of the House of Lords recently reported and said that there was no legal basis for any exit fee. So we will have to see how the negotiations go. I think some of the figures that have been cited so far are wildly out of kilter and wildly unrealistic. But we'll have to see what happens in the negotiations. As one of your panel commented earlier, there are going to be lots of hares to pursue over the next couple of years, and we shouldn't get too excited about any of them.
But do you think it likely, would you accept that we do make, it may not be as anything like the figures that Brussels is kicking around at the moment of 50, 60 billion euros, but do you accept we will have to make a one-off multi-billion-pound settlement?
If we get everything else we want, if we get a really good trade deal and access for the City of London and so on, then speaking for myself, I would be prepared to make a modest payment. But it all depends on the deal we get.
What would modest be?
Oh, I can't give you a figure, Andrew. We're right at the start of these negotiations. And I don't think that will be agreed until near the end.
The EU says that if there is a transition period of several years after the negotiations, and there's more talk of that, the UK must remain subject to the free movement of peoples and the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Would that be acceptable to you?
Well, it depends on the nature of the transitional agreement. I think we're getting well ahead of ourselves here, because you can't, I think, form any judgment as to whether there should be a transitional stage until you know what the final deal is. And if there is to be a final deal, and then you know how long it might take to implement that deal. So that's something I think that it's really rather futile to talk about at this stage. It may become relevant depending on the nature of the deal, and that's the proper time to talk about it and decide what the answer to the questions you pose might be.
Except that the EU has laid this out in its negotiating mandate, and I think it's reasonable to ask people like yourself, should we accept that?
And it's reasonable for me to say they're going to raise all sorts of things in their negotiating mandate, and we don't need to form a view on all of them at this stage.
Well, let me try another one then. Because the EU says that if they do agree what you've just called a comprehensive free trade deal, then we'd have to accept EU constraints on state aid and taxes like VAT and corporation tax. Would you accept that?
Well, I'm not sure quite what they have in mind on that. We will be an independent country when we leave, and we'll make our own decisions about those matters.
Not according to the negotiating mandate.
Sure, but as I've said, they'll put all sorts of things in their negotiating guidelines. It doesn't mean that we have to agree with them, but no doubt that's something that we can discuss in the context of a free trade agreement. If we get a free trade agreement, that's very important for them as well as for us, and we can talk about some of the things that you've just mentioned.
Well, could the Tories really face the voters in 2020 without having repatriated full control of migration, taxes, and the law?
I think we will have repatriated all three of those things by the time of the next general election.
How high would you rate the chances of no deal? And does that prospect worry you?
I think the chances are we will get a deal, and I think the chances are we will get a good deal, because that's in the interests of both sides of this negotiation. But it is not the end of the world if we don't get a deal. Most trade in the world is carried out under WTO rules, and we would be perfectly okay if we traded with the European Union, as with everybody else, under WTO rules. But it's better to get a deal, and I think we will get a deal because, as I say, it's in the interests of both.
Let me ask you about Gibraltar. You've campaigned in Gibraltar when a sovereignty issue came up under the Blair government. The EU says that Spain will have a veto on whether any Brexit deal, the free trade deal you're talking about, should apply to the ROC. How should the British government respond to that?
As it has responded by making it absolutely clear that we will stand by Gibraltar. 35 years ago this week, Andrew, another woman Prime Minister sent a task force halfway across the world to protect another small group of British people against another Spanish-speaking country. And I'm absolutely clear that our current woman Prime Minister will show the same resolve in relation to Gibraltar as her predecessor did.
Yes, Mr. Howard, but this is not about Spain invading Gibraltar. It's not even about sovereignty. It is about Spain having a veto over whether any free trade deal that the UK makes with the EU should also apply to Gibraltar. Now, how on that issue should the British government respond?
The British government should show resolve. It's not in the interests of Spain, really, to interfere with free trade with Gibraltar. 10,000 people who live in Spain work in Gibraltar. That's a very important Spanish interest. So I'm very confident that in the end, we will be able to look after all the interests of Gibraltar, including free trade.
Micheal Howard, thank you for joining us from Kent this morning.